United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Pursuant to the provisions of Section 2.68.030 of the Metropolitan Code of Laws, notice is hereby given that if you're not satisfied with a decision made by the Metropolitan Transportation Licensing Commission, you may appeal the decision by petitioning for a writ of certiorari with the Davidson County Chancery or Circuit Court. Your appeal must be filed within 60 days of the date of the entry of the Metropolitan Transportation Licensing Commission's decision. We advise that you seek your own independent legal advice to ensure that your appeal is filed in a timely manner and that all procedural requirements have been met. As I stated, we're meeting in a special meeting today that we called last month. We're going to have a public hearing pursuant to MCL section 12.62.020D as enacted by the Metropolitan Council in substitute ordinance number BL 2019-1658. We're meeting to enact interim regulations to govern the interim period of time between when the RFP process will be completed, as well as enacting regulations for after an operator has been selected pursuant to the RFP process that's outlined in the substitute ordinance. Mr. Fields, do you want to add anything to that? I know Ms. Costonis has had some remarks to also offer us.
The special meeting was called at the last, at your last meeting, and for the exact purposes you've described. You had asked Ms. Costonis and legal to develop an outline and some draft regulations, and she has done that and is available to explain either before the public hearing or after public hearing.
Have we gotten requests to speak from any members of the audience?
We have one. There may be some folks in the audience that haven't filled out a form, but
Ms. Walker?
Thank you, sirs and ma'ams. I just go on record as I've been hit 4 times on the sidewalks by these people riding.
Will you please state your full name since we're being recorded here?
Walker. Address is 301 Demumbrium Street. And like I said, I've been hit by them. I'd like to know exactly when I get hit, they pop up and they take off. So no one's really responsible because you can't chase them down. Another thing is I would like to know when y'all are doing the restrictions, because I'm understanding that they're here to stay for a while, if you can please get them off the streets at dark. That's when most of the time people are drinking and riding them. It's, it just seems to escalate the problem. Also, if business owners can confiscate them if they're outside their businesses on their sidewalks. Because it's my understanding that businesses have to maintain the sidewalk, and if they can confiscate them and dispose of them as they see fit. Because, walking up here today, I probably passed 3 that were laying on the sidewalk out in front of businesses. And another problem I saw was one that was probably 15 feet away from one of the street corrals. And no one cares to park it there. There it is, 6 or 8 of them are in the corral, and this one's laying down 15 feet away. Please enforce the restrictions too. What y'all do isn't going to mean a thing unless somebody is there to enforce it. So make them enforce it. Because I don't think it's fair to our police department to add any more burdens to them right now.
Ms. Walker, When you said you were hit 3 times, was that, were you a pedestrian or were you in your car?
Pedestrian.
Sidewalk?
Of course.
And I mean, I guess one of them happened right after the scooters came to town. Someone was filming a concert at Hilton Park and going east on Demonbreun. Of course, not watching where they were going, and just ran right into me. That time, I got a couple of bruises. But they, oh, and took off. So there's no way to, do anything to the people that are riding the scooters. Are the scooter companies responsible? I don't think they're any more responsible than somebody who makes a car, but there's no way to, catch the people who are doing this. And I've also, there was a young group riding scooters that I thought was trying to pickpocket me. When I yelled at them to get away from me, after they'd sort of bumped me, they yelled obscenities at me and told me to give me my money, which I later, like 3 days later, saw them again on scooters and took photos and sent those to the police department. But please, let's keep the pedestrians safe. And because downtown, especially, it's a real issue. I know out in the Nations area, they're littering the sidewalks out there too. And these are the only 2 neighborhoods that I'm really familiar with. But if it's happening in the Nations, it's going to start going out farther and in more neighborhoods. So downtown's just too congested for them to be riding, on sidewalks. Thank you, guys.
All right.
Please keep us safe.
Thank you, Ms. Walker. Ann Butterworth.
Good afternoon. I apologize. I just got here, so if I'm repetitive of comments previously made, I'm sorry for that. I live at 415 Church Street, and my concern with the scooters, walking here from a temporary place down at the residences at Capitol View, I was almost run over by a Lime scooter rider. She was polite in that she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." I asked her if she knew that she wasn't supposed to be on the sidewalk. She just smiled and drove off. Then a bird rider on Charlotte behind TSU did a massive U-turn right in front of a vehicle, which had it not slowed down, would have been struck. And the guy just went on his merry way. I understand that there's concerns that this program is helpful for persons seeking transportation to their work and back, the last mile. I hope that people can get away from all their cars, and we have other forms of transportation, but the majority of people I see using the scooters are using them as transportainment. They are folks coming in town, and the issues are they see whatever the rules are, they pay no attention to them, and they get on oftentimes after they have been drinking adult beverages and are not really in a position to be riding on the scooters. I know that the small red vehicles aren't on the topic today, but I saw a young person who appeared to be perhaps old enough to have a learner's permit with someone who appeared to be his dad, zooming down 8th, turning on to Broadway. With all these different forms of vehicles on the roadway, I think we have to be concerned that we're going to have more issues. If there could be a way to have a controlled use of the scooters in a way that is safe, I would be supportive of that. There are members of legislatures from other states here in our city today, and at one of the luncheon meetings there was a great discussion on the issue of scooters, and several of the people said that their experience with the scooters here was worse than in their cities. I don't know if it's true or not, but one of the people from Atlanta said that they've had 3 deaths within the last 2 weeks from scooters. I cannot give you, but I'll be glad to look to see if I can find the records for that. So again, please be aware, for those of you who do not live downtown, that particularly as it gets towards night, the people using the scooters causing the problems are not people using them to go home. They're using them for entertainment. Thank you.
Gail Wells.
Hello, I'm Gail Wells. I live downtown, so I'm directly affected by scooters every time I leave my house, walking or driving. And you all are downtown, and first of all, I want to thank you so much for your service. This is a hard thing to realize what's going to happen 2 weeks, a month, a year down the road. Thank you for taking half of them off the road. It did help, and I understand that it helps our visitors increase their perimeter. You know, I'm trying to get the good things with the bad things. The bad things is that young man dying. And that breaks my heart. I have his name in my phone. I pray for his family. To think that your son is no longer going to come home, we've got to get a handle on it, and that's your job. And I want to say thank you for doing it. I think there are too many. I think there needs to be a ratio, how many scooters per block. And over that, it's way too many. I'm sorry that our people aren't responsible where they put them. A good thing are the bikes that we have for rent. They always get docked. They always are there because they want their credit card out. That is the issue of where do you put them? And on the street, I've got several photos. I was going to go to Kinko's and get them enlarged for you, but where you can't walk. And the little bumpy edges that we have, they shouldn't be on the sidewalk, but where else are they to go? So I'm thinking until we get our traffic issues settled, we don't really need them on the streets. I've had them coming towards me in my car, and you know the big boat rule doesn't apply. I wouldn't want to hurt anyone. I just thank you for your time. I think they should go, but if they don't go, a lot less. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I haven't received any more written requests to speak. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to address the commission on the issue? At this point in time, we'll close the public hearing and begin deliberating on possible interim regulations and regulations to be used after the RFP process is completed. Go ahead, and you have to speak out loud.
Sorry. I noticed that Sergeant Bork is in the back of the room. I don't want him to have to wait. If he came here to speak, I don't want him to have to wait until the end and spend hours here needlessly. So perhaps if he has comments, we could take them now.
Of course.
He's so quiet and retired, I can imagine he was a little shy to come up front.
Yeah, usually am. No, I was waiting for you guys. So, Sergeant John Bork with Metro Police Special Events Unit. I've been gone. I was gone much of July for vacation because I had to get away. But when I did come back and we started working special events again, I did notice that there were a lot less on the street, which led to us noticing a lot less violations. However, it seems percentage-wise, it's about the same. The last event we worked at Nissan Stadium was the Titans Open House, and of course that event wasn't, well attended with 10, 12,000 folks, so it wasn't big like a Titans game or anything or a concert. But out of the dozens we saw come down the Korean Veterans Bridge, only 2 were in compliance with the law. Most of them were on the sidewalk. Some were in the bike lane, but going the wrong direction in the bike lane, meaning they were on the wrong side of the road. Makes it very hard for us at the intersections to control what's going on, because if they zip into the intersection and we're flagging cars, there's nothing we can do to those folks. We are liable in the intersection for things that occur in the intersection. I hope we wouldn't be liable for something like that because it is out of our control. We have made some signs that make them stop at certain intersections sometimes when we're working a big event. And, it's just we hope they look at the sign and follow what it says. I was on my way over here and saw 2 scooters riding, and both of them were on the sidewalk on Broadway. So whatever the sidewalk thing is, it's still apparently not getting out there from hearing these ladies speak. It seems like they're having the same experience with no matter how many you have on the road, how do you get them to comply when you get a new group of folks riding? If they're local, then you can educate them and things will change. But if you get in a new group every week because most of them are tourists, how do you educate those tourists? I don't know the answer to that. As far as the dockable thing, the dockable bikes work because they have to go back to the dock, and you have a space that's off to the side where they have to be, so they're out, you've automatically put them out of the way. I again agree with the ladies is that they're parked all over the place, and no matter how many you have, how do you control where they're parked? Says if you're in a wheelchair or you're blind and you're using a walking stick, if the scooter's laying on the sidewalk in the handicap ramp or in the middle of the sidewalk, you have to negotiate around it. I don't have an ADA issue. It's not hard for me to negotiate around them, but I would hate to be the person that does. Outside of ADA issues, when we have a large event, we have a mass of people walking, we often have to pull them out of the way and pile them up off to the side to get them out of the walking path. Because if we have hundreds or thousands of people walking on the sidewalk, one scooter in the way is something that somebody can trip over because you can't see what's in front of you. All you see is the person in front of you. So it causes us extra work to have to constantly drag these things out of the way. I will say this, over the course of the year when we had large events, the companies did really well on when Mr. Fields would organize a strategy for them for large events such as CMA Fest and the NFL Draft. The companies did a really good job of getting on board, having vans to move them around. But even then, back then, they had so many on the street, they couldn't keep up with them, the number of them that would come into the downtown area. The only other thing I'll say, and I'll take any questions you have, is I know that Knoxville, there's a municipal events conference every year, and we go to it, and we talk to other cities about special events and what they're doing, what kind of problems they're having. So it's a real place to get together. About 2 years ago, it was all about rideshare and how much we hated rideshare, and and everybody's kind of gotten with rideshare and really locked down good relationships with them and got them on board. This year, there was a lot of talk about scooters and how it was affecting their special events, and we're noticing the same type problems in other cities. And usually, it's the number is too many. And I know in Knoxville, in a meeting with the ladies that were from there, when they did theirs, they did some no-go zones where they said, hey, these are our highest pedestrian dense areas, and you're not going to be allowed in those areas. And I think they took the scooters off the street at one point. I don't know if they're back because they kept finding scooters in those no-go zones. And that's something perhaps you could do to improve where I think the scooters are valuable for transit because it does keep cars off the road. However, you got the dockable problem of where to park them, and 2, they're in some extremely high-density walking areas, such as Broadway from 8th to the river, from Korean Veterans to Union Street. If people were to ride to those areas and had a place to dock them, that was out of the way, and then they walked the rest of the way, because the rest of the way is very walkable. 8 blocks. If you're in a big city, you could walk 10, 12, 15 blocks is walkable. So 8 blocks I don't think is unreasonable for somebody to walk the rest of the way if they got the transit from a mile out or so or what have you. So I'm not the person to say if we're going to have them, not going to have them. That's up to the council and you guys. But if we're going to have them, I think you might have to look at those things to make it more livable, I guess would be a good word. So with that, do y'all have any questions for me?
Officer Bork, I have a question, and I appreciate you taking the time and sharing the knowledge and that you go out to those meetings in Knoxville and wherever else you might go. I hope you had a great vacation. Welcome back.
Thank you.
You said you guys make some signs. What exactly do those signs say?
Scooters must stop here. Yeah, they have a little stop sign on them. And then we put those on delineators at special events where if we have an intersection where we feel they're going to just zip on through, we want them to stop. We'll put it in the bike lane. And hopefully, if they're in the bike lane, we want the bikes and scooters to stop at that point till the officer directs them across the intersection.
Do you guys have, has Metro advised or made any mandates to the officers that come across the scooters going the wrong way in traffic, such as you said, coming across the bridge? Do you guys actually have any kind of mandates or anything that you advise to the officers to do when they encounter that at this point?
We don't have any mandates. It's up to the officer's discretion whether or not he wants to warn them about their behavior, take no action, or write a citation. Not a lot of citations written because it takes a long time to write a citation, but a lot of correction going on. A lot of you can't ride on the sidewalk. I spent five minutes talking to a gentleman that wanted me to show him the ordinance that said he couldn't ride on the sidewalk. And of course, I didn't have it handy. You know, we're just out on the sidewalk. But he wanted to argue about it. You know, we're telling him to be in a bike lane, but we are having conversations whenever we can. But a lot of times when we're directing traffic, and that's why the officers choose to take no action, you know, they're dealing with the pedestrians, they're dealing with the cars in the road, and they don't have time to stop and correct a scooter every time it's doing something inappropriate.
When you attended this conference in Knoxville, you said that there was one issue last year, and that seems to, people have figured out how to work with it. Some mode of transportation, I forget what it was.
I met the ladies. The conference was in, I can't remember what it was, Raleigh, North Carolina, I believe is where it was. But
there was one issue about some mode of transportation that was a hot topic before, and it seems to have resolved itself with time.
The ride share, and that just through different departments getting with the companies. And like for us, what I had to do was our venues were not, the infrastructure was not built well around any of our venues because there are no loading zones for any of them on any event day. So we make loading zones out of cones with cones and signs and make a place for the ride share to pull over for every event so we can accomplish that.
My question is, though, and in this latest one, it was the scooter issue. Yes. Or scooter problems. Do you get a sense, and I'm just asking from a general sense from your experience, that this is something that can be worked out over time with solutions that are developed through coordination between law enforcement and the companies and the people operating them? Or is this one you think the best solution is to ban them?
I definitely don't want to commit to that. I think most things can be worked out with some common sense solutions. I think what makes this one harder with the ride share, except for the really large events, most of your drivers are the same over and over again, so they get used to where to go and how to operate. So you can teach them through warnings or citations to work within the confines of the law. The problem with the scooters is because our tourism is so high, you keep getting a new group to teach, and you're not going to be able to teach them before they've moved on and another group is in, if that makes sense. That's the difficulty with
I think you've spotted the unique feature about the scooters is the lack of control over who's leasing them or operating them, and the fact that they're here and gone with the tourist. Mm-hmm. I know that awareness and education are often seen as very important components to getting people to comply with the rules and regulations. Deterrence is also another one. I mean, people stop at the stoplight or stop signs often because of general deterrence of being afraid of getting a ticket or getting caught. Have you seen any way that we could create a general deterrence for people violating riding on the sidewalk or banning the scooters anywhere?
I mean, I know the officers' frustrations that they relay to me, and they all tell me if they had electronic ticket writers, they would write tickets for them and for rideshare. The
electronic ticket writer, what does that look like?
It's usually a little handheld device, electronic, and it has a thing where you can just slide the driver's license through, and then it automatically inputs all the driver's license information into it. And then I think for most cities, just having officers describe to me from other cities of how theirs works, they would punch in the violation, And then it either print a receipt for the ticket where they're given an envelope and then they would take care of all the information in the envelope, or a ticket is then mailed to the address that is inputted from the driver's license.
If the scooter companies were to purchase those for the officers in the areas where we see scooters most often, do you think that would help?
Would electronic ticket writers help in enforcement? Yes.
Yeah, that's what
As far as who purchases them, if we would be allowed to use them and that kind of thing, those are questions for the Traffic Violations Bureau and the Chief of Police, I would think.
One other question I have. What's on the horizon for coming in next? After the scooter, have you heard anything, or has there been anybody talking about what's on the horizon for the next mode of transportation that we can see coming in?
The only thing I have heard is the dockless bikes. And we think we'll have the same issue with dockless bikes as we have with dockless scooters, is that the people that are riding them are going to just park them anywhere. Oh, I'm at my destination, just going to put the kickstand down or lay it on the sidewalk and walk in and not park it properly. And you'll have the same problem of we have too many at one place. Once things get real busy, I don't have as much time to do Bridgestone, but earlier in the year, I like to hit some Bridgestone events and see how things are going and see if there's any adjustments to the plans we need to make. And what I noticed is just piles of scooters right there at the intersection of 5th and Broadway, and that's where everybody walks. And in every event, we have to drag all those off to the side, because when everybody comes out and you've got 12,000 people coming out the front door, you don't want them to have to walk into anything that's not a permanent structure, right? You want them to have as much free flow as possible. So that's always a big problem. And if we get the dockless bikes, I think you'll have the same issue where we're having to move these bikes out of the way, so we're having to find spaces to push them off to the side.
Sergeant Bork, one of the things that I know our office is doing, the Transportation Licensing Commission office is doing, is a cost study. And part of that is figuring out what are the costs to Metro for enforcement. And one of the things that we discussed at the last meeting was whether it made sense to include in the cost study the cost for hiring additional police officers, like an FTE, full-time employed police officer, to help enforce the scooter regulations. And it sounds like including things like electronic ticket writers ought to be considered too. Has the Metropolitan Police Department given any thought to, if the funding was there, creating some designated officers whose role would be to enforce the scooter regulations?
I know there was some talk in council about not just scooter regulations, but overall lack of enforcement for Metro ordinances, just because they're kind of on the lower end of the spectrum as far as priority. And, that would be a question or a discussion with the chief of police of how we would designate our officers as far as priorities go, as far as the level of crime is concerned.
I guess what I'm asking is, because there's a big assumption there, like assuming the funding is there, like your department's going to get X hundreds of thousands of dollars so you can hire additional officers for this function. Because it's my understanding we're not able to simply pass on fees to the scooter companies without them going clearly to address the costs associated with the reason why the fee has to be generated in the first place. If the funding was there, would the Metropolitan Police Department be willing to have officers dedicated to enforcing the scooter regulations?
That's way above my pay grade. Yes, that's chief level for an answer for that.
Thank you.
Sergeant Bork, could you comment specifically on the dusk to dawn restriction that we enacted last month and the appropriateness of that, especially in our downtown core?
I know we think it's a good idea. Anytime you have a small vehicle with, there is some lighting on it, but it's very small and they're much harder to see. and you take that element out of the equation as far as vehicles having to be on the lookout for them in and out of the road, especially the way we've seen some of the riders behave, where they just dart through intersections. They're on the sidewalk, then they're off the sidewalk, which I believe caused the death of the young man that was killed. He was on the sidewalk, he wanted to transition to the roadway, and we see that a lot, where they're at speed transitioning from the sidewalk into the roadway, or in the roadway at speed transitioning to the sidewalk, and often on the wrong side of the road. So a lot of danger for pedestrians and for drivers of vehicles and for the scooter riders that are engaging in that behavior. Also, the later at night it is in a district such as downtown, where I don't know how many bars we're up to down there, probably 100 or so, all within a very small area. The chances of someone getting on one intoxicated is a lot greater, and I think the earlier they're off the street, the less chance you have of that. And that would definitely lend to safety as well.
Thank you.
Have you been seeing scooters operating in the evening since we passed the new hours restriction?
That is a good question. Since I've been back, I've only worked 3 events, and most of it has been during the daytime hours with events ending at night, and I really didn't pay attention to the scooter use, because that's when I'm kind of in the egress traffic mode and really paying attention to our traffic. I can't say that I could answer that. We can keep an eye out, though.
Any other questions? Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I know prior to today's meeting, Mr. Field circulated to us draft regulations that were prepared by Metro Legal. Would this be a good time to hear from Ms. Costonis?
Sure. So I wanted to give you all something to use as a starting point, keeping in mind that it is just a draft and you can obviously make any changes that you want to within what the Metropolitan Council delegated to you in terms of authority. So I would probably start with it kind of explaining what the Metropolitan Council did ask the TLC to do in Substitute Ordinance BL 2019-1658. So the ordinance, as you know, also requires the development of an RFP. And we talked about that a little bit at the last meeting. But the part that we're really here about today is subsection D, which says the MTLC is directed to immediately enact emergency regulations to govern the interim period of reduced fleet operations in Metro, as well as operation after an operator has been selected pursuant to the RFP process outlined above. So these regulations would go into effect immediately and remain in effect even after the RFP is issued and awarded. The draft that I did, just to have a starting place, since Chapter 1262, as it had existed prior to the enactment of Substitute Ordinance BL 2019-1658, which voided most of the provisions of it, was the closest thing we had to an existing framework for regulating SUMDs. So I took most of that language and put that into this draft. However, Ordinance 1658 had asked that there be certain things specifically put into those regulations. And so those things are listed in the ordinance, D 1 through 8 of the ordinance, and I put those things into this draft as well, with one kind of little caveat as to one of them. Then I took what you all had done at your meeting on June 27. You all had made several recommendations to council as to what you would like to see in what at that point we were talking about was a code chapter. Since most of the code chapter is now gone, and for lack of a better word, the guts of it would now be in these regulations, and these are your regulations, assuming that you would want to stick with the recommendations you made in June, I incorporated those provisions into this draft as well, as best I could. Then there were maybe a couple of things that you all had done even before that I also tried to incorporate. There may have been a couple other little things that came from other sources, but for the most part, that kind of covers where the draft came from. So if you have any questions about that, I'm glad to answer them, but obviously you all can deviate from these. Even what 1658 said, the council said that they wanted you all to have in there. It did say indeed that those regulations shall at a minimum require. And I read that phrase at a minimum to mean you can go above and beyond what they asked you to at a minimum require. So the one caveat that I was mentioning earlier was what Commissioner Palmer was just mentioning, the dusk to dawn issue. The 1658 asked as far as like operating hours, that those be at a minimum restricted after 10 p.m. on weekdays and 11 p.m. on weekends and metro holidays unless the operator institutes an impaired user function as a prerequisite to writing SUMD after these hours. Since you all had already done something that I thought went above and beyond that provision in enacting the dusk to dawn provision, I incorporated the dusk to dawn provision in this draft. And so we also did get some comments from Commissioner Rogers via email. I see he's not here today, but we would be glad to share those with the other commissioners also if you all would want to hear them. And I'm glad to answer any questions.
So within those mandates, one thing that I heard from Officer Bork while he was here was that they had taken it upon themselves to make some signage, but also that one problem that he ran into with actually trying to educate someone is them wanting proof. Is part of that process, one of the things that I would think is at the corrals to actually have the ordinance printed off in the same way that we put a no parking sign up, that ordinance be printed off and permanently put where the corrals are, so that who's ever using those cannot say they were ignorant to that ordinance as to where to operate them. I don't know. I know that's not part of our mandate, but I know you said we were able to go a little bit outside of the box. Would that be a recommendation, or at this time, would that be something they were mandated to do?
I suppose you could propose something like that. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how many pages long it is, so it might be, it would be maybe a very long sign.
No, I mean on where to operate them, not the entire.
It would not be a challenge to take specific things that you wanted and place them there. In fact, one of the things that has happened this week, if you'll go down on 4th Avenue near Broadway, we had I guess a pilot of a pilot working with 3M Corporation to see if we could mark the pavement. And we did take the corral that's in that vicinity and mark it with a large film is what I would call it, that actually goes on to the asphalt. So it's probably possible we could do something along those lines, or it may be possible to actually place a sign, a metal sign that would say TLC rule such and such, or Metropolitan Code of Law such and such, forbids the operation of SUMDs or scooters on sidewalks and or in whatever. So yes, we could do that within reason. We'd have a challenge doing, page after page. But if the commission identified 3 or 4, 2 or 3, something, we could certainly work with this.
Specifically what I was thinking.
So there is a provision in the bill in 1658 in the minimum requirements that they asked to be included, so that I then did include in the draft, where 1658 says that the minimum requirement they would like to see is signage that indicates that SUMDs are not to be operated on sidewalks in areas where the MTLC determines sidewalk use is to be prohibited. Each permitted operator shall reimburse the metropolitan government for the cost of the signage on a pro rata basis, up to a maximum of $10,000 per company per year. The signage shall be installed by the MTLC or the Department of Public Works. So that is already kind of contemplated in this draft, although it didn't necessarily contemplate a reference to the source of authority. With regard to the source of authority, I guess I would just also say from kind of a general legal perspective that ignorance of the law is no excuse. And I think if at some point when there is maybe an ability with increased fees to have increased enforcement, some people getting cited and having to deal with that may also have a deterrent effect in terms of people starting to take it seriously and understand that this is a real law that they really have to obey.
Right. And I was just taking from what Officer Bork said that the education of the residents that normally use the scooters has helped. So rather than to do it after the fact, we all take driver's tests and we study those books, but I couldn't recite one ordinance from when I got my driver's license. But yet if I see a sign where I'm not supposed to park or where I'm not supposed to go, that immediate education prevents me from doing that.
Mr. Chairman, one of your options, in terms of this kind of a discussion about, there are some operators here that might be able to give some insight to if you want additional information.
I'm looking at section 025, application for permits through the RFP process. It's on the second page of the handout I received. And I noticed under section A, there's 1 and 2. It talks about bicycles and electric bicycles. Why is that in there?
So that's in section 030, I think, actually.
030, safety.
Yeah, so that is taken directly from 1262-030 of the prior chapter. That was in the chapter that was enacted by council and that has now been, for the most part, rolled back by council and replaced with these regulations.
So we are considering things regarding bicycles and electric bicycles?
So, I mean, that would not be a change. So SUMD is, let me read you the definition of SUMD. SUMD, Shared Urban Mobility Device, SUMD system or system, means a system which provides urban mobility devices for short-term rentals for point-to-point trips. Such a system can be locked to SUMD system or a dockless SUMD system. And then an urban mobility device is defined as a bicycle, tricycle, scooter, hoverboard, skateboard, pedal car, and other similar devices, whether they're powered or non-powered. A UMD does not include devices used as assistive mobility devices by persons with disabilities. So we don't regulate UMDs to the extent that they are personally owned by people. But if you operate an SUMD system, that is what 1262 formerly regulated and what these proposed regulations, since they were based on that, would regulate. So it would include any kind of UMD that is part of a SUMD system, including bicycles. What we have, and obviously this was drafted before we really knew what SUMDs would look like in Metro Nashville. And so it was contemplated at the time that there were going to be a lot of shared bicycles. And so electric bicycles, there are some CFR regulations and National Highway Traffic Safety Administration definitions that apply to those, and so those were incorporated by reference in that original legislation. So I think one of the comments that Commissioner Rogers had forwarded by email was that he would like to see some distinction between scooters and bicycles, and maybe kind of a incentive to have more bicycles as opposed to scooters be part of the SUMDs that are made available.
I just want to know the rest of what the SUMD that we're talking about here today. 'Cause it seems
So
to
it
now
would
include
include other things
bicycles,
besides
tricycles,
scooters, yes.
hoverboards, skateboards, pedal cars, etc.
If they are part of an SUMD system.
I'm sorry, you said the comment was to have more bicycles than scooters, or vice versa? From Mr. Rogers. More bikes.
Yeah, so from Mr. Rogers, let's see exactly what he said.
I don't mind reading his letter.
Yeah, you want to just go ahead and read it, Billy? You got it?
If I can. He sent an email and shared it with legal, said, I looked at the proposed rules, and since they're basically the old ordinance, I can't add much. I do think it's important to clarify the issues on bicycles as B-cycles as to whether they are or are not an SUMD. 040K refers to motorized vehicles. Should it say motorized SUMD? 040Q says Public Works is to continue working on parking places. Is that something you can put into the rules? It's okay with me, and you can require them to build bike lanes while they're at it. As I told you, I do not like 050M, but it is now the law. If B-cycle is an SUMD, did the council just ban them from parks and greenways? They have kiosks in several parks. I thought Vandy wanted SUMDs. Are they working on their own deal? I guess we can't raise the $35 fee, or does that wait for the RFP? I would double it or triple it. Are the date requirements the same ones that were in the original, the data, if I could read or see, if the data requirements the same that were in the original ordinance, do they need to be changed? I would like to toughen up 070E so there is no threshold for 1,000, that there is no threshold for 1,000 SUMDs, and to require them in a promised zone. How about making it 500? We should also require them to have low-income programs rather than just encourage it. I would also want a requirement and or incentive for companies to bring bicycles. Maybe one bicycle would give them one more scooter up to a limit. I also think a proposed bicycle in RFP should get extra points. Those are some random and unorganized thoughts. There's no need to respond, and take it for what it's worth, if anything. And he said in a post note says, will the commission's authority increase or decrease their fleets, be in the rules or in the RFP or both? That should be made clear. So he's out of the state and wanted to make sure that he was heard, or wanted to at least share that with you.
So I can answer some of those questions. His first question was about B-cycle. I had that question from a couple of other sources as well over the past couple of weeks. So I think that might be a good one to go ahead and address in the public meeting. But I think the answer is no, they would not be included, because the shared urban mobility device system definition says a system which provides urban mobility devices for short-term rentals for point-to-point trips. Such a system can be a Lock 2 SUMD system or a dockless SUMD system. So the phrase point-to-point, I think, is kind of a term of art that is understood to mean that you are retrieving the SUMD from wherever it is located originally and taking it to your destination and leaving it there. B-cycle, or we'd also had similar questions about shops that rent bicycles. I think would not have the point-to-point qualification that the definition has, because there you would have to return the SUMD to a docking station or to the store that you rented it from. So it's not really point-to-point. So we think that would so that would address his concern on that. Where he refers to 040K referring to motorized vehicles, no, it should not. Just because at the time, again, this was kind of originally being contemplated, we didn't really know what kinds of SUMDs were going to be introduced. I mean, it's turned out to be pretty much exclusively scooters, but it could morph in future into some other things as well. It was quite possible that some of the things that would be introduced would actually meet the state law definition of motorized vehicle. And so we wanted to make sure that anyone who was driving an SUMD in some future form that met the definition of a motorized vehicle would be required to have a driver's license, just like they would for any other motorized vehicle. That was why that was in there. I would take the comment about bike lanes to be more of a sarcastic aside, maybe.
I think that was an aside that he would have. He's certainly a spokesperson for more bike lanes.
The B-cycle comment also addresses the question about 050M. If they don't meet the SUMD definition because they're not point-to-point, then they are not banned by this from being on the greenways. The greenways did have a prior rule that no motorized vehicles of any kind could be used on the greenways. So putting this in these regulations, which was required by the bill 1658, really kind of just codifies what parks had already required. So that's not really a change. And then the question about Vandy. So, like I said, I tried to incorporate some other previous things that this commission had done, and one of the things that you all had done was adopt the red zones, where parking of scooters would not be permitted, and in the case of Vanderbilt, an area where the operation of scooters would not be permitted. And so that map that was part of that meeting, was that the April meeting, Billy? Am I remembering that correctly? Where that map was adopted, we wanted to incorporate that into these rules as well, since that was something you all had previously taken action on. So it wasn't so much that Vanderbilt didn't want SUMDs, it was more, I think, that they did not want them in places where people would be leaving the medical center and kind of be in mobility devices, and having scooters fly by would not be good. So it would be limited to that specific exhibit, which would then become an exhibit to the regulations. The $35 fee is subject to the cost study that you all authorized at the last meeting, so when the results of that come back, you may be able to change the fee provision. The data requirements are the same that were in the original ordinance, and Billy and I talked to ITS, who informed us that it was fine for them to remain the same at this time. And the other remaining issues, I think, are things that you all could consider and take up: toughening up 070, requiring the low-income stuff, programs, and incentives for bicycles. At some point, I think he's right that it is tough to determine kind of the boundaries between what will be in the RFP and what will be in the regulations. And certainly, I think there are a number of things that could be in either or both. Certainly, I think at the end of the RFP process, the RFP will probably result in a contract. And if it mirrors some other similar arrangements we have in Metro, the likelihood would be that the contract would incorporate by reference the regulations. So that would be kind of part of what they would be required to do as a part of that RFP process as well through that process. But the increase or decrease of the fleets are specifically not addressed in this draft of the rules, although that might be something that you could adopt in future, because that seemed to me at this point in time to maybe be something that the RFP drafting committee was going to be looking at more.
I think so.
So you actually cannot effective immediately increase that $35 cost.
I mean, I think you would probably be prudent to wait for the result of the cost study, just to have like kind of a basis for your decision to increase the fee.
Recommended that the SUMDs not be operated on the sidewalk, but looking at 030C, subsection 2, apparently the warning would say whenever operating one upon a sidewalk.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite follow that.
Well, what I'm saying is I thought we had recommended that the scooters in particular not be operated on sidewalks, because we've heard from people like Ms. Walker, Ms. Butterworth, Ms. Wells, and many, many other people about the problems.
I did struggle with that one. I went and looked back at the minutes from the June meeting to try to see if I was kind of interpreting that correctly, and I looked at my notes, and I may not have interpreted it correctly, but I said that in the area where the corrals are, they cannot park on the sidewalks. Was that a too narrow interpretation of what they previously enacted?
And
Well,
business district.
Well, they've never been allowed to operate on the sidewalk in the business district. And I don't know if
030C?
we changed that with our recommendations, I don't remember, but they are permitted to ride the sidewalk outside of the business district.
One of the police officers
Right,
made the
yes.
point
And I
that
think
it's
Yes,
that's what they
distinguished.
wanted us to identify.
One of,
reference to the business
one of the
district.
recommendations from the RFP staff subcommittee that Mr. Fields provided to us earlier this morning was that we should consider better clarifying what business district means. The definition that's in the code is really vague and probably impossible for the normal, typical rider would be able to know whether or not they were in the business district or not. I mean, unless it was just obvious, but
So the definition of business district is taken from state law, and it currently says, as defined in Tennessee Code 55.8.1019, means the territory contiguous to and including a highway when, within any 600 feet along the highway, there are buildings in use for business or industrial purposes, including but not limited to hotels, banks, or office buildings, railroad stations, and public buildings that occupy at least 300 feet of frontage on one side or 300 feet of collectively on both sides of the highway.
so maybe the easier question is, what is not a business district in Davidson County?
Well, the conversation that we had during, again, there's, you directed us to establish the RFP committee. We also then established a staff committee. And one of the things there was that the recommendation may be that you drop the idea of a business district and then identify specific areas. If you don't want riding on sidewalks, you say, we don't want it from here to here, here to here, and say they can't be ridden here. It may be fine when you get to a certain area that it's okay to be on sidewalks, but you just go ahead and identify specific business areas, and it could be it could be as broad as you want it to be. You could say no sidewalk riding in the county. That may not necessarily make sense, but it might make sense to say, since with the business district, when you get it, it's should they ride across the bridge, for instance, the Victor Memorial Bridge out here, should you ride on the sidewalk or or the street. Well, I think there may be a bike lane out there, but it's certainly not a business district. But there are people walking back and forth. So again, I think that may be a discussion the commission can have, not necessarily can resolve it today, but could certainly begin that kind of a conversation, and also ask either traffic and parking or public works engineering to, if you have specific questions about areas, saying we'd like to know this and this and this, and then direct them to do that.
Ultimately, the goal is to provide safety for pedestrians on the sidewalk from scooters that are going 8 miles or whatever down traveling. And I did note that there was also in that email you sent out, the question about the 8 mile per hour limit, that they're not fast enough for the street and too fast for the sidewalk. And I think that's something I've heard over and over, that the scooters are too fast for sidewalks and not fast enough for the street.
Well, at 8 miles an hour, that was Mr. Bird's concern from planning. Is there a better way? And
that's just for the slow zones.
So that was part of the minimum requirements that council asked you all to adopt. They asked for those 8 mile an hour slow zones to be placed in, I think, Broadway and 2nd Avenue. So since that was, again, a recommendation at a minimum, if you wanted to go above and beyond that and make the slow zones slower or make them non-operating zones, I think you could do that.
So Billy, you're saying we could do, for example, no riding on the sidewalks from the river to 8th Avenue, from KVB to Church or Union or whatever.
correct. And you've already actually done, well, in the previous meeting, you already had said there will be no parking on sidewalks on Broadway from 1st until 8th, or the river to 8th. So you could go further than that.
I think, and maybe putting words in their mouths, but I think in adopting the requirement about posting the signage everywhere about not riding on sidewalks where you can't, council might have been trying to make that more legible to riders.
And we're certainly working with traffic and parking and engineering to find ways to properly mark.
I was hearing from folks today that they live downtown, they step outside of their building, and they're at risk with scooters. And I understand, as we're looking at areas to say they're banned from the sidewalks, that should improve that situation. I'm also thinking, though, that the other areas that we have these larger buildings going up and people residing there is the Gulch, I think down Charlotte. So I almost wonder if we need a study to figure out exactly where these areas would be, not so much about a business perspective, but where high-density people are living and pedestrians are walking the streets.
A study from the high density or where the scooter's being operated, or both?
I think more where high-density people residing in structure.
Well, they're already banned from sidewalks, even before the regulations or the substitute ordinance was passed. I mean,
Back into my question earlier, which is, why are we saying
no,
they
in
have
the
to
business
district? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me clarify. So they've always been banned from riding on sidewalks in the business district. That's undisputed. Now enforcement has been
Right.
horrible. They're ridden on sidewalks all over the place. In the substitute ordinance that was passed by the council, at a minimum, we're to establish slow zones, Broadway between 7th Avenue and Cumberland River, and then another slow zone from 2nd Avenue between Broadway and Union Street. What I'd like us to consider is making those two slow zones a no-ride zone, and that's what Sergeant Bork was recommending, or at least throwing out there that we should consider, in making that very small area of downtown just walkable, a walk zone, as opposed to a scooter allowed area. And I think that would contribute significantly to the scooter walker congestion problem that we're hearing. I mean, we've heard from 3 people today, and I know we've heard from others at other hearings where had been hit by scooters walking on the sidewalk. So, I mean, we certainly have the authority by council to go above and beyond the minimum required things that we're supposed to do.
Mr. Chairman, so I have given you my interpretation of Bill 1658. However, I believe we are getting some indications that there may be other lawyers in the room who disagree with my interpretation of that and who would like to speak to that issue, if you would like to hear them.
And potentially react some of it, because some of it is a little different. A lot of it's exactly the same. There is some difference. So again, I think there's some folks that may want to react to it, and just in a idea of fairness, it might be appropriate to do that.
Who do we have wanting to speak?
Afternoon, Mr. Chairman. James Weaver, Waller, Lanston, represent Lime. Thank you for your time and your efforts in working on this today. Council spent an enormous amount of time debating the bill that you have in front of you that you're attempting to interpret today. It went through numerous drafts, 2 or 3 different substitute bills and amendments to the substitute. Most of the items today that you're discussing were heavily debated both in the committee process at council and on the floor during the floor debate that was extensive and hours long on this bill. With all due respect to my colleague, Ms. Costonis, the language about at a minimum, she's actually got it reversed. And what at a minimum was discussed on the council floor and what they intended to create was a set of rules that you couldn't go any stricter than. But so let's just take the night riding as an example. If you wanted to allow 11 on weekdays and midnight on weekends, they intended to give you that authority, but they didn't intend to give you the authority to crank it back from 10 and 11. There are numerous instances throughout y'all's discussion where that concept will work its way into it. None of us who represent and work with the regulated entities have seen these rules. We're sort of just sitting back here in the back listening and hearing about them from the first time. I assure you, I speak for everybody, but I know I speak for me, that I'd much rather have this discussion with your lawyer yesterday or this morning as opposed to having it here on television. My request, as sincere as I can possibly make it, would be if the regulated entities could have an opportunity to review these rules and comment back to you guys in writing about these rules. That's not unusual with regard to rules and regulations that are issued by metropolitan agencies and boards like you, and it would seem to the folks who are going to have to live by these rules to be an appropriate opportunity for us to comment back. Again, I have no idea why I drew the short straw. I think I'm the one in the suit, and so they made me come up here and do this. But we would sincerely, I know I speak for most of the providers, if we could have an opportunity to see these rules and comment on these rules, I think we would end up we would end up in a better place, and that would be our. Again, I'm not really not prepared to argue the legal niceties, other than to tell you, I was in the floor debate. I was in the room when this was being drafted, and this is not what they meant. But that being said, if we could communicate that to you in writing, as opposed to me up here babbling about it, that would be our request. Thank you.
Are you saying the regulations that Ms. Costonis gave us today, you didn't get a chance to see? Okay, well, you understand that they're largely taken from the prior ordinance and then the recommendations from the substitute bill. They're all put together, so you've had that for a long time, right?
I've had that for a long time, yes, ma'am. But I haven't had, for instance, this interpretation that the legal department has with regard to what at a minimum means. I've had that for about 15 minutes.
Well, I was engaged in the council meeting as well by television because I didn't have the stamina to be in the courthouse at 2 a.m. But I can specifically recall and took specific note of at least one council person saying, I know there's a dawn to dusk to dawn restriction, and we certainly don't want to interfere with the rule that the TLC has already passed. Moreover, I don't think anyone's recollection of what they think they meant is really the governing thing here. I mean, I don't think that's how we determine what their intent was.
Well, the floor debate would go into with what the intent was. I guess what I'm saying is that the 28 members of council who voted for this knew that you had a dawn to dusk regulation, and they passed this. And it says something totally different than dawn to dusk. And so statutory construction, which would apply to an ordinance, might say that later passed trumps. But again, I'm not here today even remotely prepared to argue that. What I'm asking for is simply an opportunity for the regulated community to look at these as their own, written on paper, and provide you back comments. That's all.
I believe that Ms. Hillman may have some extra copies that y'all can have. Oh, Mr. Fields has.
Would that be a start?
I have a question. Our purpose today is we are to make recommendations to council of what we think should change or be added to.
We are passing regulations that will go into effect immediately.
Okay, so that does not go back to them. Okay.
Mr. Weaver, one of the concerns I have by delaying is that we won't have any regulations. So I think we are definitely today going to pass some regulations. Now, whether or not that goes above and beyond the 8 at a minimum regulations that the council wants us to do, I don't know yet. I will read from...
So that's a good question. For instance, I know you're a lawyer. My client asked me, what's the law today? They asked me this yesterday. And I told them the law is those 8 things. Follow them to the T today. And that's the advice that Waller, Lanston, Dorch, and Davis gave one company. I don't know what the rest of the companies got, but the advice I gave the companies is that the law today at midnight last night when that bill became...
bare minimum. I mean, there's so many things that the substitute ordinance just totally removed from the old ordinance. And so right now we're implementing, a lot of them should be non-controversial.
Sure. For instance, the slow zones, the no-ride zones, no-ride zones.
I'm not talking about the 8 things listed in, I don't want to miscite the number, 020D 1 through 8, and I'm talking about all the other portions of the substitute ordinance, remove several sections of the old one. So the point being, I think we're going to pass some regulations today. I think it would be irresponsible for us not to. But again, the question is, will we go, when it comes to 020D, are we going to exercise discretion and go above and beyond what's listed as 1 through 8? The section that you referred to earlier states that in addition to any regulations the MTLC believes are necessary for the safe and efficient operation of an SUMD fleet within Metro, including but not limited to establishing additional fees it determines are reasonable and necessary to carry out and enforce this ordinance, the regulation shall at a minimum require. And then it lists the 8 things that you've mentioned before, including the
slow zones,
no ride zones, some prohibition on operation after 10 p.m. on weekdays and 11 p.m. on
manpower
weekends.
requirements, helmet activities, and response times. Yes, sir. and the ADA hotline.
So I just want to understand what you said. You instructed your clients that they were permitted to operate up until 10 p.m. despite the fact that the TLC passed a dusk to dawn restriction.
Well, there's a.
I understand.
And I think I can address that question. I'd like to, because I don't. This substitute bill did not become effective until yesterday.
I understand that.
So prior to yesterday, the hours of operations were dusk to dawn.
Yes, sir. No question about it.
And I have probably how many photographs, videos?
We're going to have to be discussing those violations that have occurred since that rule went into effect.
So it would be.
You have numerous.
It would be sheer irresponsibility for us to move that time period out when it was being repeatedly and blatantly violated while it was in effect and while they knew it was in effect up until yesterday. But I understand the interpretation difference. I'm saying I was at the meeting as well, and there were specific comments that, well, we don't want to infringe on what the TLC has already done, and therefore they're going to be at a minimum. So,
I think, Mr. Weaver, I think what we should do, unless the commission votes otherwise, if we do decide to limit hours back to what we had previously, obviously you can take that up to the Chancery Court if you disagree with that. But I think based on the advice we've received from Ms. Costonis from Metro Legal, I mean, we're being told that we can pass regulations we believe that are necessary for the safe and efficient operation of SUMDs within Metro. And, you know, I was following the council meeting as well, and there was a lot of deferral to this commission. I mean, it was, and a part of it was it's really complicated, and it's very time consuming, and I get that, and you got to really get down in the weeds.
And if this had been, if this particular provision had been, if we had known today that it was going to be discussed this way, and we didn't, and again, not totally acknowledging, day before yesterday, dawn to dusk is the law. If you're operating dawn to dusk, you're in violation. Period. Hard stop. Agree 100%. But what you would have heard during your public comment period today is a number of people who work downtown and who don't get off work until after dusk, and this is their way home. And we would have filled the room with people who said, I use this mode of transportation to get home because I work at Tootsie's. And they're not drinking at Tootsie's, they're working at Tootsie's. But we didn't have the opportunity to bring those people in for your public hearing because we didn't know about this interpretation until we came into the room. And again, you're exactly right. The council not only defers to you guys, but appreciates you guys. If there's a more thankless commission in the metropolitan government, I don't know what it is. And they say that over and over and over. I hope that's not coming as a surprise to you. This is a really hard commission, and the council absolutely defers to you on this kind of stuff because y'all hear it every day. But you have to know this is coming as a huge surprise, or I wouldn't be standing up here talking about this. There's an RFP coming up. I assure you, I don't want to be up here arguing with your legal counsel in front of you, a couple of months before we're going to put an RFP out on the street. But this is a total shock. This is a total shock to everybody in the industry. It's 180 degrees with what we thought was in the bill, what was debated in the bill, what we agreed to when we agreed with the sponsors to support the bill, and that just is what it is, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your position, and I'm going to sit down now if that's okay.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Weaver.
And I would reiterate that
I would maintain our earlier interpretation of the required at a minimum language. I have discussed that with the director of my department, and he does concur with that interpretation. And so we just wanted to make the alternate perspective heard so that you all would have all of the different perspectives.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes.
And I share the opinion of a lot of what Mr. Weaver said, but I'd also want to request, if you will, the dawn to dusk idea, and I can see that we're going to move back to that, and I understand the position, but I would like or request some objective timeline on that, so that way from a data perspective for the ITS department, sure, did somebody get out there too soon, too late, whatever, because obviously we're about to get real competitive. We're all singing Kumbaya. We're out now about to start pointing the finger at each other. So, in daylight savings time, then it's 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. or 7:30, whatever it is, and in the fall and standard time, it's 6:30 a.m. to 6:45 p.m. Some sort of objective criteria instead of just dawn to dusk.
Anticipate that, Mr. Holland, and it defines it as dusk being up to half an hour after sunset, and dawn being beginning half an hour before sunrise.
So that way we can tell our employees, get them off at this time. And to the other point being made, we take ours off the streets at that time. We don't leave them out hanging around. Yeah, you see them, you can put your phone up to them, but you're not gonna. They're locked. But we take them off the street, so they're not even available. Thank you.
And that's something that has been noted. Uber and Jump are have been rarely seen. I mean, like I said, I have hundreds photographs, videos, after dark, pitch dark. I got hit by one last night. I will share with you. Coming back in the rain.
Was it an hour?
It was not. It was not. And in my black car, pouring rain, turned and hit me right in the side. And I was terrified because I thought, God, please don't let this person be dead. Sure. So we're all watching for them because we have to be, because, the people just aren't careful on them. So I wanted you to know that I agree with you. You guys have been good citizens in that regard, although I think I did get a jump, 3 days ago? But the primary offender is Bird. It's always been Bird. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that to you.
Thank you.
I see another attorney in the room raising her hand.
Oh, this is Ms. Butterworth.
I'm Ann Butterworth. I have worked for governmental entities and in the interpretation of statute and ordinance, and I respectfully disagree with Mr. Weaver's interpretation. You only go to the intent when the plain language of the law or the ordinance is ambiguous. This particular language, saying the regulation shall at a minimum require, is unambiguous. It means you have to at least cover these areas. What additional items you put in would have to fall within the scope of your entity areas. Clearly, you couldn't start to regulate a health item that goes under the health board. But I disagree with Mr. Weaver's interpretation, and I agree with your counsel's legal interpretation. Thank you.
One of the things that I wanted to make sure we brought up today, not that you can discuss it or make a decision on it, one of the things that I was asked to do was to make sure that we were monitoring any violations of dusk till dawn. Mr. Holland's comment is well taken because, for instance, on July the 21st, dusk would have been at 8:30. If you check it today, it will be at 8:15. It is a moving target, so I actually asked for reports. We started out doing reports that would go 8 to 6. I then refined it down to 9 to 5. and could go further if need be. So one of the things that I had planned to do was to give notice to all the companies with violations during a period of time and require them to come to the August 22nd commission meeting to describe the violations. Some of them I've talked with them about, and it appeared to be it's possible that there were glitches in software systems and added software. Some of them may not be, but each ride should be able to be described. And without going into all the detail, my intention was to notify each company, share with them those nights which Metro IT advises me there have been violations, and then ask them for explanations for that. So the notice would have been going out probably Monday, but since there are several here, I would be giving them notice today that they're going to be required to come to the commission in August, just to describe, and they may have explanations, because one of the issues that happens that we've learned is if I start a ride at, if today 8:15 is today, I started at 8 o'clock, that ride will not terminate on the books until I actually turn the scooter off and turn my app off. So once the app, it terminates. But if it starts at 8, they have no way of stopping it until I stop it. Once it's stopped, that scooter should not restart. But once I've engaged the scooter, it's my impression, based on conversation with the companies, is it's going to continue until I physically turn it off. And so there are going to be some violations, and they should be able to tell us that, yeah, we had on the 10th, we had 3 that started at 8 o'clock. They terminated 8:15. It was this one, this one, and this one. Here they are. Here are the GPS proof. So, again, I have not shared the specifics with the companies yet because I wanted to make sure that y'all wanted me to go forward with this at a meeting. But there are some substantial violations over a period of time, and many of them are photographed. But in my case, these are not about photographs. They're just, this is what happened. They may have explanations.
In that case, I would not even want to begin to recommend that a ride be terminated mid-ride because it started at 7 and where they were going ended at 8:15 and you stranded them somewhere in between. I would think for me, being on the council, that I would not consider that a violation. And in that after dawn, someone was able to walk up, access that system, and start a ride, that for me would be a consideration of a violation.
And again, that's the reason I asked that reports be 9 to 5, because that should be, all of those should be outside the area of dusk till dawn, 9 to 5, 9 to 5. There still could be some violations. There still could be some justified violations that actually started prior to depending on the night and the circumstance. I would be shocked if all of them were.
Well, right now, the draft regulations that Metro Legal prepared have the dawn to dusk rule prohibition, but they do say prohibited 30 minutes after dusk and then allowed 30 minutes prior to dawn. I mean, I guess the issue I have with the point raised by Mr. Holland in coming up with an actual fixed time in which the operation should cease or begin is one of the reasons why we implemented the rule in the first place is safety. It wasn't necessarily because we felt like there were a lot of impaired drivers at 6:30 in the evening. It was because they're difficult to see. Mm-hmm. And so having a fixed time is difficult due to the fact that the sun's always moving. And as you pointed out, tonight dusk is at 8:15.
8:14.
Last week it was 8:30.
A couple of weeks ago, sure.
I mean, from what I understand, presently, when the dawn to dusk rule was in effect before yesterday, the scooter companies would shut off their scooters if they weren't being used. So if you went up to a scooter after dusk and you tried to operate it, it just wouldn't come on. And it's fairly straightforward to be able to look up on a weather app to see, okay, when is dawn predicted today? Okay, it's going to be at 8:36. All right, so today we're going to be shutting off our scooters at 8:36, or in this proposed regulation at 9:06. I think that's probably the only logical way to address the issue of the whole purpose of the rule in the first place, which is to improve safety, is to continue to base it off of when is dawn and when is dusk, as opposed to, okay, summertime hours, 9 p.m., wintertime hours, 4:30 p.m., or whatever the random time we would select.
As long as their technology can adjust almost daily, I don't see a problem.
If it can adjust to shut it on and off, it can vary. I've got a son that's a programmer. That's a keystroke.
I don't know how hard or how easy it is. So.
Since I still don't have a copy, can you tell me how the new rule addresses the unless the operator institutes an impaired user function as a prerequisite to riding after these hours? How did that make it into the new rules?
I'm sorry, I was trying to get your copy. Now, what was the question? I'm sorry.
So the ordinance says that prohibition of operation after 10 p.m. on weekdays and 11 p.m. on weekends and metro holidays unless the operator institutes an impaired user function as a prerequisite to riding the SUMDs after these hours. Is that in here?
No, because it was the dawn to dusk was absolute. It was not. It didn't have an exception. So again, it would go back to the at a minimum requirement interpretation, that because that is above and beyond what the council passed, that is a more maximum requirement rather than a minimum requirement, so that they could do that. And of course, they don't have to. They can change anything they want to in this draft, as long as it's not inconsistent with the council ordinance.
Well, the purpose of today's meeting is to we have to take a vote. We have to either pass regulations. We can do it piecemeal, take issue by issue. We could do it in one fell swoop. It probably makes sense to take some of the more deliberated points and call those out and vote on those separately, and then we can clean up at the end and pass the rest if that's what we want to do as a commission. But we obviously can't just say, oh, to Mr. Fields and Ms. Costonis, good job. We have to vote for these regulations. So
since there's been a lot of discussion of this particular provision, I wanted to bring everyone's attention to the specific dusk to dawn provision in this draft, which is section 050L, and it's kind of toward the end. I'm sorry, I don't have page numbers. But it says, operation of SUMDs is prohibited after dusk and before dawn. For the purposes of this rule, dusk shall be defined as ending a half hour after sunset, and dawn shall be defined as beginning a half hour before sunrise. MTLC or its staff may establish additional limitations on the hours of operation of SUMDs. So if you all wanted to add something to that, or edit or amend it, you certainly, I mean, you can change anything you want to in this draft.
Can I throw something out there? You have that down there that the staff, the MTLC or its staff may establish additional limitations. Let's say a special event came in, they coordinated with Sergeant Rourke, they coordinated with Mr. Fields, but it was going to be getting some transportation from one place to another, but it's after these hours. Does that mean that we could grant an exemption like we have done for the low-speed vehicles?
So I think so. That language was actually, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, carried over from original 1262, that last line.
Yeah, that just, when it says we could add additional limitations, I just wonder if we could modify this.
Yeah, well, you can change that to say...
To the language of modify if a situation came up where we thought it was appropriate.
Yes, what I would suggest that you do is change the word limitations. Staff, MTLC or its staff may modify or additionally limit the hours of operation of SUMDs.
That would be my suggestion. I'm just trying to envision a situation where someone comes and asks an exemption. Mr. Fields is frowning at me when I talk about that.
No, I'm not frowning. I'm good. I want more authority. Now, this was a much, their version, the latest version actually took a lot of authority away from me, so. And the new one may unfortunately probably give me some of it back, but I don't need any authority. I'm good.
If we're going to talk about modifying, based on a particular circumstance, shouldn't we say that, like per request or upon request to the commission or how, whatever?
Quite often, when we've had similar situations, Mr. McNally was speaking, it would be a special event issue, and then we'd go to I typically would talk to traffic and parking, talk to the police, and if everybody said, hey, that makes sense, we would approve it. So I understand what you're saying is...
Or if we came up with if something came to our attention and we decided on our own volition to modify it, I'd like us to be able to have the authority to do that. So.
How about adding at the end, comma, upon request to the commission or its staff, or upon the commission's own initiative?
Mr. Chairman, is this something we vote on individually, or I mean?
I think this is one of those issues that it would probably be helpful for the record to have a clear vote on it.
Do you want me to reread the whole section as with the modifications we just discussed?
Yeah, then I think I can follow with the motion.
Okay. Operation of SUMDs is prohibited after dusk and before dawn. For the purposes of this rule, dusk shall be defined as ending a half an hour after sunset, and dawn shall be defined as beginning a half an hour before sunrise. MTLC or its staff may modify or additionally limit the hours of operation of SUMDs upon request to the Commission or its staff or upon the Commission's own initiative.
I make a motion we approve as revised.
I
second that motion.
that section right there.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Before we piecemeal any further, I'm correct to understand that we are not here to decide whether SUMDs are to be banned or not. We are here to look at regulations that the council has already approved.
That is correct. The council ordinance does not allow you to ban SUMDs.
It does allow us to make no ride zones, though.
Correct.
Or slow zones,
even
no
floor
zones.
I am just wanting to get on public record that we do not have the authority to put a ban on the scooters as has been requested by many people to me. Thank you.
On the fines that were listed in the ordinance that we have in front of us, are those standard fines, or how did we come up with those amounts?
So they were taken from 1262 originally, except for, I think that there was a higher fine that was consistent with just the general fine that is allowed in the Metro Code for violations that where it's not otherwise specified, like the maximum fine is $50. It was requested that that fine be applied for instances where scooters are found in bodies of water. For that would be 50. In all other cases, I think it would be 10 or 25.
But no more.
I saw one in the river this weekend. Is that what that means?
I believe the river would probably meet the definition of a body of water, yes. The body of water definition is taken from another Metro Code provision that is referencing to littering in bodies of water.
I think that's what it was.
Seems to me the next area that we seem to have had some discussion was whether to create no-ride zones. And perhaps maybe collateral to that is the definition of business district, but
I think that was one of the direct things we were to address was the definition of the business district, to make that, to clarify that, since any business in any area could be considered a business district no matter how far out it is.
I think
Probably an efficient way to handle that for now is to go ahead and use the language business district. It is defined. It is a defined legal term in the code that we can use if we decide we need to change it to be and create actual zones of operation like we have for low-speed vehicles. Then I think that's going to require getting out maps, and it's going to require a lot more time than we have today.
And what I will say is,
You all have an ongoing ability to modify these regulations, having adopted them. At any point when we just notice it as a public hearing to amend these regulations, you can amend them at future meetings.
well, and also if we do revise it to make certain areas a no-ride zone, then it may make the definition of a business district moot.
I do think at a minimum you do have to do the no-ride zones and slow zones that the council ordinance specified.
And right now, the no-ride zones that I see are the metropolitan greenways and metropolitan parks, except on paved streets within the same.
And then that was what was in the ordinance. I added to that the Vanderbilt University and Vanderbilt University Medical Center areas shown on the attached Exhibit A because that was something that you had adopted in the past.
So that's what we're going beyond what the council had.
That's where you're going to the maximum rather than the minimum again.
So one question, I guess, here now is whether whether M1 and 2 should be slow zones or walk zones.
Or no ride zones.
I'm in agreement with you. That was going to be my suggestion.
I wasn't necessarily advocating one way or the
Okay,
other. I'm
well,
just
let me
trying to
just-
put something on the table.
Let me just.
Or to even make the zones even slower, since no one has said that option, because they do have the ability, they are slowing them down in the slow zones to make them even slower in the slow zones.
I'm just wanting to get it on the table so we get some discussion going.
So we've heard from Metro PD, and we've heard from many residents, and even council has suggested that we at least create a few no-ride zones and slow zones on Broadway and 2nd Avenue. I am suggesting that we consider a no-ride zone between the river and 8th Avenue and between KVB and either Church or Union. And to Mr. Weaver's point that, there are people downtown working, if there's a scooter at 8th Avenue and you're working on 2nd Avenue and you need to take your last mile transportation, you can pick one up at that corner of 8th Avenue, or you can pick one up at the corner of KVB. So that's not, I don't think that's an unreasonable distance for a person to walk to get their last mile transportation. It eliminates the safety issues with the highly densely populated area down there. It eliminates the safety issues with regard to the extraordinary traffic in that very congested small area. It is a very small area. It's not like we're, instituting a no-ride zone for the whole city. But this area in particular has been especially problematic. We've had a high number of injuries. We've had 1 death so far. I think it's time that we consider having a no-ride zone in that section of the city where we're so densely populated.
Mr. Fields, on that area that's just been described, do we have any corrals there?
Yes. Most of them are, well, in fact, all of them would be in that area.
Are they currently slow zones before this ordinance?
No.
It's on this map, Billy. It's all the green boxes, correct? The
Mhm.
corrals.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I know it could be moved pretty easily, right?
Are there any slow zones currently in effect right now?
No, sir.
Do we not have a slow zone between 2nd Avenue and Broadway and Union?
You did not create a slow zone. You created a park. I think you said that we shouldn't park. No parking on 2nd between Broad and Union. And then you also created a no parking zone on Broadway from the river to 7th, I think.
Okay, so are the ones I'm looking at here labeled slow zones recommendations?
No, this is the minimum that the council has told us to implement.
Okay. Not yet implemented.
Well, it correct. We've been directed as effective yesterday to implement interim regulations and post-RFP regulations, and at a minimum, they have to include those 2 slow zones and then these 2 no-ride zones.
Okay. Can we hear this gentleman?
Sir, would you like to address this? Of course. I was trying to find a good spot to
Of
insert
course.
you.
Thank you, Commissioners. And I'm Sam Reed. I'm with Byrd. And I share, obviously, Mr. Weaver's opinion. This absolutely comes, a lot of this discussion comes as a surprise to us. I think both in hours of operation, slow zones, now no ride zones, we weren't really given notice as to these were the things that were going to be discussed and gone above and beyond what we passed at what was sort of discussed at length at council. I mean, the hours of operation, for instance, I think that's absolutely a worthy discussion that we ought to have. Decisions that were made around it should be data driven. We should actually have a discussion. I think the last time that restriction was passed, it was about the 6-hour mark of a meeting, and it was. We haven't had the ability to give input around it. Again, like there's a long history. There's lots of information we can share of how this is dealt with in other cities. Again, I think it was just passed again. Dawn till dusk restrictions. I would certainly agree that the things that were passed in that ordinance that were at a minimum, those what we believe, what our sponsor believed, I think what council believed that it was voting on, those were the things that would be the baseline. And that those would be adopted by this commission today or the rule of law beginning last night. And so, again, I would just ask that we be able to we notice the things that are going to be discussed. We're able to give input. We come prepared with data, with testimonials, rather than it seemingly now just things being made up as we go along. So that's all I wanted to say.
Just to know, we are definitely going to be making some decisions here, be it a guideline mandated. We've been dealing with the issue as well, but as data comes in, as legal has told us, we have the ability to adjust. But today, if we err on the side of safety and need to adjust later, that is literally our mandate here is public safety.
Understood. We absolutely share in that goal, and it's just a lot of this is coming to a surprise for us. So, just wanted to note that. Thank you.
Just talking about the data for 1 second. I don't mean to diverge, but Mr. Fields, there have been some discussions about I think Ms. Costonis indicated that the data sharing provisions, or you indicated that IT said they should remain the same.
Yes, that's correct.
Have we gotten any closer to the companies actually being able to provide what we need? Because I know the last time I spoke with IT, we weren't getting what we need, even after a year.
So I think they may recommend that you all change them in future because of negotiations that they are having that are ongoing with the companies, and also in terms of discussions with other cities and data standards that other cities are looking at and improving, perhaps. But for right now, they said their recommendation was to keep what was in Chapter 1262.
Okay, but my question's more to the ability and the ability to comply and to provide actually what we need and data that can be verifiable.
I can't answer that every company is in absolute full compliance, but again, what I've asked the IT folks is at the point they believe they're not compliant or in the process of not becoming compliant, then we need to bring it back to the commission. So we can ask for a report. I know that we're getting data from all the companies. We are creating reports. In fact, that's the way the report that we'll be sharing at the August meeting will be those companies that at least on paper is violating has violated, not from here forward, but has violated from this point backwards the dusk till dawn. So we are getting data. I cannot tell you we're getting 100% data from everybody that is usable. We're getting data from everybody. Some of it they use the term scrub to get out the things that we don't need or that is irrelevant to what we're doing.
Okay, one of the things that was specifically brought to our attention, or my attention, when I heard someone having this discussion with, I think it was maybe Jesse or the IT person, was that trips were being represented to have been taken when it couldn't have actually been a trip, i.e. someone picks up a scooter and moves it, they're calling it a trip. And there was a lot of concern around, are the numbers being inflated? What can you tell me about that?
I really can't tell you. I know they were getting, that was at a point, IT was working on that and other issues, I think, to refine it further and say we're only going to measure trips that are more than a minute. Or in other words, because I'm assuming people might engage a scooter and then stop. So nope, ride for 2 seconds or 2 minutes and say I don't want to do this. I don't know that, but I think that's what he was referring to.
But it was to Mr. Jesse Journey that we posed the question, did these need to be changed? And he said no, not for the time being.
Okay.
So we do anticipate a change. By the time we get to the RFP process of the completion, I think that it will be different because, again, Metro is working has been talking with the industry around our industry, I believe, as well as looking at how it's working other places. And I think they've come to understanding of there may be yet a better way to do it.
I guess the reason I'm asking is because we have, some people standing up and saying, hey, we want to have an opportunity to address this and bring you data. Well, if they're bringing us data and the data is not accurate, then I want to make sure that we know what we're getting when we get it and that it's reliable.
We could ask IT we'd have to get the data in advance, and we could ask IT to do a comparison, which is what I anticipate at the August meeting of I'm going to give them what I've got that IT says, and then they were going to have opportunity to show, well, no, here's what the reality was.
Okay.
We had 8 scooters in the back of a truck. They should have been deactivated, but then we were taken to the warehouse. Here's this, here's that.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
to leave in a few minutes. I had something on the calendar for several months now that I need to get to. I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. Whatever we vote on today, we do have the ability to change once we get more data or other discussions happen.
You can, your rulemaking authority allows you to amend your prior rules by noticing it as a public hearing at a subsequent meeting.
I don't know if anyone else has to leave, but if we have to vote on something today, I'm just throwing the time limit out there to make sure that we still have a quorum. I know if I do, I think we still have one, but I mean, I don't want to rush everybody.
Yeah, and I
It's
think
important.
we do, as a committee, kind of, we probably need to zone in on what we need to throw this as a blanket and cut it down to shirt size, so to speak, later.
I want to be careful, though. I mean, the decision we're making today, I mean, we have to make sure that we're not being making any arbitrary decisions here. That, you know, there needs to be a deliberate, thought-out, rational reason why we are passing these regulations, and not just, oh, we're going to put a Band-Aid and just let's get more data. We have a tremendous amount of data already, and we've been discussing these issues for a long time. We've had several hearings. We've gotten a lot of information from the companies, from Metro IT, from Mr. Field's staff. We need to be making deliberate decisions, and I think we can. You're absolutely right, Mona Lisa, that at any time we want to amend our regulations as a commission, we have the absolute ability to do that, and we should do that. When new information comes forward, when we get additional data, any reason why we need to consider making a change to our regulations, we ought to consider it. But I want to be careful that we're not just throwing together in a slipshod fashion regulations. So.
No, and I only meant that in areas that we do not have enough information at this time to pinpoint. With the information given that we have now, you're right. We've been discussing this for a while. We have enough information from the public as well as from documentation brought to us to make decisions this day. But without the information that Billy is able to provide for us for the ongoing study, I think what I was trying to say is that some of those specifics we will need to adjust, and we do need to address them, but not to so much as to make them so finite that there is not room for adjustment.
Right.
Do we know on point 1 of section 2, 12020 D1 on these slow zones that we're to implement at a minimum for Broadway between 7th and Cumberland, and then
Are you referring to the sections of the ordinance or
Yeah.
the sections of the draft?
the sections of the substitute ordinance, that the minimum 2 slow zones. Do we know if the companies are able to physically control the speed of the SUMD to be no greater than 8 miles per hour?
I can tell you the safety. Slower than 8 is not safe.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you, Mr. Weaver.
Slower than 8 is not safe, and it rhymes.
But Mr. Weaver, you can control the speed of the SUVs in certain zones, correct? Okay. And I can say from my own anecdotal, my legal intern told me that he takes one from Belmont down to my office, and he says there's certain areas where it drops down to a lower speed. I don't know if it's 8 miles an hour or what, but he doesn't do it. It automatically is adjusted. Okay.
Why is slower than 8 unsafe?
Mr. Weaver?
Or at the same building?
Weaver?
Absolutely, yes.
That's why we agreed to it.
I couldn't hear what you were saying, Ms. Weaver. Could you please step forward?
I think our safety team, if they were here and could address this issue, would tell you that anything under 8 is very difficult to actually control the unit. So 8 miles an hour was specifically discussed and selected by the council as what slow means, because less than 8. I don't ride them a lot, sir. Yes, sir. I think so.
To keep it up.
Again, we don't have. I didn't know we were going to discuss this, but it's a balance thing.
Well,
I mean, I can just barely walk from here to the door without falling, but that's my understanding that it's a balance, and so that's why the council picked 8 miles an hour.
Right. I'm gathering that. The language says that use of technology where reasonable and practicable to create no ride and slow zones where operation of SUMDs or where speeds in excess of 8 miles per hour is not permitted in the following locations. And then it identifies those 2 slow zones we've been talking about. So based on what you're saying is the substitute ordinance for these 2 slow zones, the regulations will at a minimum say that in these 2 areas the scooter can't go faster than 8 miles per hour, but you're saying that actually if the scooter goes less than 8, it starts to become wobbly.
The speed in the slow zones, so you've pressed the accelerator, the speed will be 8.
Okay.
And it's intended to do a couple of things. Obviously, there's a safety factor of slowing down, but there's also it's to encourage less ridership in those zones. I mean, you see where those zones are. They're in a tourist district, where the slow zones are. The no-ride zones were put in the ordinance because that's what Parks asked us to put in. That language came directly from the Parks Department. That's how it ended up in the bill. The no-ride zones, the slow zones were requests from stakeholders on 2nd and on Broadway, and to slow the units down, and that will likely, to the extent that we're concerned about transportainment, is that the word you guys use sometimes? 8's not as much fun, and so the idea is to allow our employees who work in the historic district, in the honky tonk district, who use these things. I assure you, there are hundreds of them. To still allow them to walk outside to their corral, get on their unit, ride it slowly till they get out of the slow zone, and then go home. That's what was intended.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, you can say anything you want to, sir.
I didn't want to interrupt you, but I have 2 sons that ride skateboards, and they definitely are able to control them. I know that's 4 wheels under 8 miles an hour. It's still a little bit more wobbly, being that the focal points are. But again, for public safety, I've played football most of my life, and from me to you, I can't go 8 miles an hour. But if I were able to hit you from me to you at 8 miles an hour, my body to your body, it would definitely do an impact. So basically, if you're telling me that we cannot safely slow the SUMD down under 8, that it should not operate there.
What I am telling you is it was council's opinion that we needed to create slow zones in on 2nd Avenue and on Broadway from 7th to the river. And they wanted to create slow zones in those 2 locations, and the question was asked, what's a safe speed for a slow zone? And 8 was the number where we ended up with council. That's what I can tell you.
But 8's not a great speed for an impact.
Again, I didn't know we were going to be having a discussion about physics And had I known we were going to be having a discussion about physics, you'd have somebody standing at this microphone that knew something about physics, and not just a poor country lawyer. I just didn't know we were going to be talking about this. We have, as do all of the large companies, we have enormous safety staffs. I can fly a whole plane load of people in here from California to talk to you about all of this stuff really in a lot of detail. But I didn't know we were going to be talking about any of this. So I don't know. Yes, sir, you could be right. With respect, you could be wrong. I don't know. That's part of what I said earlier, is that it would be so much better if we had notice and an opportunity to comment on this stuff before it just becomes law.
I thank you for indulging.
No, I thank you. It's my job.
I thank you for indulging me in that we do have the ability to adjust it if I'm wrong. But again, we are here for safety. And for me, until I know that that's wrong, and you're telling me, you are telling me that you guys have already determined anything under 8 is unsafe for that.
I'm telling you that's the number
to
the
operate.
Council. I'm sorry. I'm saying that the council selected that number. That's what I'm saying. That number's in the ordinance. That's the number that came from council.
And those recommendations you sent Billy earlier from Peter Bird at Planning had suggested as well that, we don't want them on the sidewalks, but in his opinion, or at least that's how I'm reading it, that capping their speeds at 8 miles per hour is not safe to be with traffic.
He does have some very specific opinions about scooters moving in, not necessarily in bike lanes, but in traffic when it gets as slow as 8. And I suspect some of that's going to find its way into the RFP about asking those questions.
Peter Bird's recommendation.
I wonder if it's consistent with the slow-moving traffic.
Maybe more than one copy. You can pass it down if people want it.
That we're talking about.
Slow-moving as in our slow-moving vehicles?
Slow-moving cars, trucks.
So in other words, just the traffic speed.
Is much slower from 7th down to the river and from the Korean War Bridge over to Union. I think I walk as fast as many of the vehicles down there do. Move.
Except for the SUVs.
I do have a question of how we're going to move forward to get this done today. Because we've been running late almost every meeting, and I'm afraid
I think that
need to move.
This might be an area where the conservative play would be to implement what the council has put in the substitute bill as a minimum starting point. And then, of course, that can be strengthened or tightened later. I know Ms. Palmer has suggested, and she didn't make a motion, but she kind of put it out there that we should maybe think about an entire radius from the river to 8th Avenue and KBB to Church or Union as a no-ride zone. I think maybe we need to think about that more at a different meeting. But I certainly understand. We heard from Ms. Wells today, from Ms. Butterworth a couple of times, from Ms. Walker. They all live in that area. I think we should probably think about creating no-ride zones downtown, but we'll be here for a long time if we keep deliberating that point right now. The chief purpose for today is to get the guts of these regulations enacted so we have some regulations in force, effective immediately. I mean, if we want to consider making a no-ride zone or a slow zone, I think we need to make a motion and we need to vote on it. And if it doesn't pass, we need to make another motion until we get to a point where we have a majority.
So can we actually make a motion for, this is section M, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are the recommendations. Do we need to make those recommendations individually, or can we make them?
Well, they're not, I want to correct the wording. They're not recommendations. They're minimum regulations that we are to implement per the council.
The minimum regulations?
Yes.
Can the minimum regulations be implemented as a total, or do they have to be done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5?
You're talking about. Hang on.
We can go above and beyond them.
Please, Ms. I just want to clarify something. You're talking about just for number 1, right? The 2 slow zones and the 3 no-ride zones, correct?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, we can take them up all together. We can take them up one by one.
Or we could take up the entire regulation that Ms. Costonis put together for us, right?
Well, we've already ruled on 2, number 2.
Yeah.
We passed a motion on the hours of operation.
050L.
And that's number 2, which is the prohibition of operation of SUMDs at a minimum, had a minimum requirement of prohibition after 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. on weekends.
Mr. Chairman, what I'm going to say is not a reflection on the work. I like the ordinance or the rules that Ms. Costonis has put together, and because basically it's what the council already had in 1262. It was also the will that you had already presented, and then it was also pulling in what the council had passed on 1658. I think one of the things you could do is you can adopt the amended those parts of Council Bill 1658 is amended, which is the one you're dealing with right now. You could also you could adopt all of the regulations that were in 1262, and then if there's anything in this particular one, for instance, you've already made it clear what you wanted to do on dawn to dusk, whether or not there's going to be appeal and everything else, that's a different issue. But I think you could do that, and then anything else, you could come back. We could identify that a thing and say these are the other thing. These are the other recommendations that we would make. But a majority of what you're looking at today was in 1262, period. The vast majority of it. And then factored in 1658s and the other things that you've asked for.
1262 encompassed dusk till dawn as well?
No, that was the original bill that was passed by the Metro Council, and that ended up being it was an amended bill too. So there was actually 12. There was one before that. So
it was BL probably
2018-1202, which is what's codified in the code, and then there was another, I want to say BL 2018-1441 amended that, but has not yet been codified. So when I took the baseline of this, I incorporated 1441 on top of published chapter 1262, and then took that as the baseline and started adding in what council required as the minimum requirements and the items that you all had previously adopted at the June and April meetings.
1658?
no, here, let me back up.
That's a separate bill. Sorry. What 1658 did is it then took both of those prior bills, 1202 and 1441, and it voided everything after the definitions section. Then it adopted a new section 1262.020 that just required the RFP and required you all to adopt regulations, including these minimum requirement items.
What you've got are bill numbers, and then you've got codes. You've got the Metro Code of Law. 1262 is the code. The others were bills.
Yes.
So those two first, the original bills ended up creating what is 1262.
Right.
Then 1658, as amended,
deleted
most of it, and then sent it back to you,
and
saying
said the TLC shall make regulations to address the operation of SUMDs, in addition to doing an RFP in order to figure out who to give the certificates of public necessity and convenience to.
Okay, so unless someone else wants to do this, I'm gonna do this layman style and just say, recommend these 5 with the addition of the dusk to dawn provision still be enacted.
And when you say these 5, do you mean?
I'm going to list them, a slow zone between Broad and 7th, a slow zone between 2nd and Broad and Union, a no-ride zone on the greenways, a no-ride zone within metro parks with the exception of paved streets located within the same, a no-ride zone at Vanderbilt University Medical Center area shown on the attached Exhibit A, as well as the dusk to dawn rule being reenacted. I don't know if it's been.
So you all already did a motion amending the draft 050L, which was the dusk to dawn rule. So
Okay, so I don't
that
need
was
to include
already
that.
adopted as amended.
Okay. So, again, I'm going to do this unless you know how to encompass it. Okay. I make a motion that a slow zone be created between Broadway and 7th Avenue and Cumberland River. I also make a motion that a slow zone be created between 2nd Avenue, Broadway, and Union Street. A no-ride zone be created on any metropolitan greenway. A no-ride zone be created within any metropolitan park except on paved streets located within that same zone. No, a ride zone be created for the Vanderbilt University and Vanderbilt University Medical Center area shown on the attached Exhibit A.
I have a competing motion.
Well, that's out of order.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Do we want to have discussion on it? If there's a possible competing one?
I might need to defer to council on Robert's rules. So we've got
You
to.
can have a discussion
Okay.
after a second is made.
Great. I would like to do that for Ms. Palmer's sake. Would you like to make some comments?
My comments are simply what I said before, that I think it's really, in light of all of the testimony that we have heard, in light of the death, in light of the many injuries that we've had downtown, in light of the density of the population, the density of the traffic, I just think the more prudent thing to do is to, in addition to these 3 no-ride zones under M, 3, 4, and 5, that we make a no-ride zone from the river to 8th Avenue and from KVB to either Church or Union. I just think it's the prudent thing to do. I think public safety requires us to take a serious look at this after everything that has happened.
Church to Union, are you just talking about 2nd Avenue, which is the recommended slow zone, or are you talking the encompassing like the big block of from 8th to the river, KVB, that
correct.
block, not
The
just
latter.
2nd Avenue?
Correct. That's my thought on it. I think it has a significant amount of support for that position. I hate that a life was lost on our streets. I hate it. It haunts me every day. We have the power to prevent that from happening again. I think that's my responsibility.
Do I need to defer to her
Is-
position? Or?
No. Is there any further comment? You seconded his motion?
I did.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Mona Lisa? You said nay?
Yeah, she said nay. I don't disagree with Ms. Palmer. I think it is dangerous, but at the same time, I think we need to get something on the books and we can revisit that, correct? If we have more information.
Yeah, we need to walk out here today with some rules.
Okay.
If this motion doesn't pass, I can make
Well,
another one.
right now, here, well,
Well, right now,
You need to vote.
Okay, nay.
all right, so we've got a tie. I vote yay, so motion passes.
So basically, we've got, you've passed the issue of operational hours. You've also got issues of slow zone and no ride zones. We're still in a place where I think, as I said earlier, I think at a minimum we should at least adopt what had already been on the books officially for the Metro Council. By the same token, you can take up the rest of. I mean, again, I think what Ms. Costonis has written is good legislation.
Regulations.
I'm sorry?
Regulations, not legislation.
Regulations. But if we don't, and again, for instance, if you don't want to do all of them today, we should at least be able to adopt the others, which say you've still got to bring the data. You've still got to. It identifies what a SUMD is. It still says they've got to meet all the federal standards. It shows what the penalties are for illegal. It says where you can't park vehicles. So there's a lot of things here that we need to have, or there won't be anything.
Mr. Fields, when you say we could adopt what Ms. Costonis has written, the regulations, what would be the title of that? The document I'm holding in front of my hands here, it says TLC Regulations for Shared Urban Mobile Devices.
With
the
that's up to you,
with,
but that's
no,
what I put on it, yes.
with the revisions that we have already passed.
Yes, I think
here today.
after you make these specific amendments to these specific sections, and so far I think you made an amendment to subsection 050L, but then you kind of approved draft subsection 050M as written, that you could then adopt the draft regulations as a whole, but with the prior amendments that you have
which really only
approved
revises one section.
so far.
Yeah. All right. I make a motion that we approve the document entitled TLC Regulations for Shared Urban Mobility Devices, and for more clarity, it is the document prepared by Ms. Costonis before us, with the revision that was made regarding the time of operation.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes. All right, that concludes our agenda. Do we have any other business, Mr. Fields?
The one thing we talked about at the last meeting was placing a member of the commission on the RFP committee. We left without me bringing that back up. You don't have to have a member, but we certainly talked about it. If the commission would like to have a member on that committee, couldn't do two because then there'll be a conference. You can't.
It'd be a subject open
But you could send a member. We had one organizational meeting. There'll be another one tomorrow afternoon. So if the commission would like to take that up, you could, and appoint someone or not.
I'm happy to do it.
Nominate or make a motion to recommend Ms. Palmer
Second.
to be a representative.
All those in favor?
Aye. And thank you.
Motion passes.
Yeah, I would like to add, as to the motion I previously made regarding adoption of TLC regulations for shared urban mobility devices, that was made after careful consideration by this commission, with months and months of public input, as well as that occurred here today, and frankly with some dissension among the group, the commissioners here. I mean, it was not just a knee-jerk decision. It was carefully considered by this group, and I appreciate the work that Ms. Costonis has put into adopting what has previously been on the book, as well as the recommendations that we made in prior commission meetings.
Thank you, Mr. McNally.
Thank you, Mrs. Stone.
I think that's right. I just want to say I think there are a couple of little items that we may want to, in fact, revisit at the next meeting, and they're, pretty specific ones, and we can pull those out and look at them.
I would expect you all to make significant changes.
Okay.
And one thing I'd like to look at, instead of a blocked zone of no operation, that we could start using more of a scalpel to find streets where we think they should not be operated on, rather than entire blocks.
Yeah, and in some cases, not even entire streets.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information about this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.